So yeah, what brings you to Cape Town?
I've come to Cape Town for a conference called Fish Crime. So it's a symposium that's been funded by the Norwegians, and I'm here to meet with government officials from Africa who have responsibility for their fisheries, and we're hoping to come to Africa next year and help these countries out with their fisheries. So we bring in a vessel or two and some men, and hope to catch some of these crews that are catching all the fish of Africa and shipping it offshore illegally.
So can you take us through the sort of crimes you're up against?
The main thing we target is foreign vessels fishing illegally, and if you take a typical African country like Kenya, over 50% of their fish is harvested illegally by foreign vessels, and of those, a big chunk of them is Chinese and a big chunk Taiwanese. They're probably the worst two countries in Africa at the moment for illegal fishing, but they're really hard to catch. The vessels, they remain offshore. They have what are called reefers, these big refrigerated ships that come in. They take the fish off these smaller boats offshore, and so the fish never touches land, and you need to get out there with vessels to catch them. And that's the problem for coastal Africa, is it takes a lot of resource and a lot of understanding to go out and target these boats. And so I think we've been doing this in Central America and Asia for the last few years, and so we're hoping to come here and help these countries of Africa with the same thing.
And you're up against some big countries. How do you sort of conceptualize taking these guys on?
You sort of find a vessel takedown it's an abject lesson in psychology, and there's a few things you need to do, and one is to have perceived overwhelming force, so that when they see you come alongside their vessel, they think, like, these are professional guys, they have legitimacy. So you generally fly like a flag from the country you're operating in. You'll normally have one or two of the Coast Guard or Maritime Police or whatever the organisation is that would actually have jurisdiction, and you just want these guys to think, man, we don't want to fight these guys, and they give up. And if you do that, it does run relatively seamlessly. But sometimes we've had a few difficult cases. We had a few years back, I had a Zodiac got shot up in Central America when they took exception to us, and then they were naughty buggers, those guys. So it doesn't always come off, but the hope is that I can continue to catch these boats and bring my crew home safely each night, and add a little bit of value to it. Illegal fishing is a big crime in Africa, and it's a massive problem. The scale of it, like, it is billions of dollars that are being stolen from here, and Africa pays a heavy price for it.
And what's the best way to patrol these waters properly? Because as you say, a lot of the food source of Africa is going out the back door.
Yeah, the problem that Africa has is you are seeing the depletion of the fisheries to such a degree that is pushing the people into targeting animals on land. So, kudu and antelope and all these other things. So the bushmeat trade is booming, but there's this double whammy on the environment. Your fisheries depleted, and now you're depleting more the land fauna. But they're not easy to catch, and you need to have vessels on the water. If you're not prepared to put vessels on the water, you're not going to catch these guys. You'll catch a few that maybe have to come into port, or the smaller operations that don't have reefers. You'll catch a few of them in port, but the really big operators, you need vessels on the water to catch them, and that's not so easy. And the hope is that if we can help these countries and give them some training and take them out on our boat, and it's not to say we know everything what to do, but take them out on our operations, they can see what we do, they can figure out what works for themselves. The hope is that these countries will eventually be able to invest in their own vessels, so that they're not dependent on NGOs like ourselves to come in here and help.
And it was quite ironic, during the height of piracy, suddenly the fish stocks around Somalia were going up. So
wasn't that amazing? The situation in Somalia was quite complex. Like, the fishery largely got cleaned out. There was what at the time was the largest factory ship in the world, a big Irish vessel, and that fished down there for several years. Plus there was some Spanish and Portuguese, and they did effectively clean that coastline out, and you had all these fishermen whose livelihood was gone. ID had a fair chunk of power at the time, AK-47s everywhere. Next thing, piracy sort of blossomed up under that environment. And then piracy became so rampant, they were all making money there, no one was fishing anymore. and the fish stocks have rebounded. It's one of the great things we have in ocean fisheries is the stocks do rebound. It's not such a strong case in freshwater fisheries. Once they go on, it takes a long time to recover. But the oceans do have a way of rebounding if you don't take them below a critical mass. But I do fear at the moment there was too many countries that are just allowing their fishery stocks to be plundered. And they need resource and money to go policing these things, and at the moment they just don't have that. Now I think in many ways it's up to some of the wealthy countries to go supporting Africa in this. If you take a patrol here, you need at least a couple of $1 million boat to do effective patrols, and you need a lot of fuel in that boat to go running an effective mission. African countries don't have that sort of money, and I think the problems that Africa has, you just look at for example, the migration that's happening from North Africa up to Europe at the moment. A lot of that is economic, not all of it, but a chunk of it is economic. And fisheries is one way these people can help to become sustainable and feed themselves, but not if it's all going offshore. So I think countries like Europe, and you're seeing that here at the conference here in Cape Town, Norway has funded this conference. And they've put a lot of money into fisheries support in Africa. I think other countries need to step up and do the same, and especially in terms of helping to provide vessels. I haven't got the resource to come here and hang out 24/7 in Africa helping them with their fisheries. I'm going to come and do 6 months, but long term they need their own solutions.
And then how do you and then collaborating with local governments in South Africa, how have you found that?
Yeah, one of the keys for us is we need to work with the local units, because otherwise we're just vigilantes or pirates, and eventually you will get closed down if you're doing that business. So we need to work with local units, and there's this two-way sort of partnership that happens. We come along and we train up their unit. We give them, especially on securing boats or hostile vessels safely, is not easy. And you try and do that at night, you try and do it when they've got armed personnel on board. It does become really difficult. And so we train up the local units. We'll normally hire a couple of local boats or get some impounded vessels and go out and practice the boarding, practice the search and secure methods, and then we take the guys out and we'll go and run some missions. And it's a great thing to be involved, but the key for us is we do need some local units on there to give the operation legitimacy and to make sure that prosecution happens. We don't want to bring these boats in. It's happened to me several times. We've had vessels that we've gone and taken down, and then the prosecution, due to corruption and other things, hasn't happened. And my guys risk their lives on these missions. We don't want to see vessels go unpunished. We want to see them prosecuted, and even if it's not necessarily for fish crime. Fisheries, in fact, is about the hardest thing to prosecute a boat for, but these illegal vessels, they are in violation of so many laws. They'll have species that are protected under CITES. They'll have endangered species on there. There may be tax fraud. There's forgery of documents. They have a vessel registration in multiple countries. The crew are probably not qualified. There's often human rights violations, human trafficking, where these fishermen are often held in most appalling conditions that would never be accepted in, say, a South African vessel. So there's multiple crimes, and we want those bastards prosecuted. For what we don't care if we don't get them for fisheries, let's get them for tax evasion, or let's get them for document fraud, or let's get them for whatever we can to make their life hard.
So do you have an attorney with you, coming along with you? But surely that you need that almost to take
I've got a few lawyers in different parts of the world that help advise us and what we need to do to make sure that we're operating within the law, and to help us out if we get in trouble. And I'll get into trouble sooner or later. It's just the nature of the beast of it.
And dealing with fear, and how do you get around that?
I've got most of my crew are former special operations guys, and they're used to dealing in difficult situations. And there's a certain, I've had enough tricky situations now that I'm very conscious. My job, I need to make good decisions, and I've got crew helping me with those decisions. But yeah, sometimes I still shit my pants on occasion. Just the way it is. I think if I wasn't scared at times, there'd be something wrong.
Yeah, and a lot of South African viewers would have last seen you on Whale Wars. You had a bit of a sticky ending there. What sort of experiences did you take out of that?
I guess one of the things I found on whale wars, and probably the viewers won't know, but I had a boat called the Addie Gill. We took it down to Antarctica to work against Japanese whalers. The whalers ran over my boat. I boarded their security vessel off a jet ski in the middle of the night. They took me back to prison, back to Japan as a prisoner. I did 5 months in prison there. And I didn't like being on the wrong side of the law. It wasn't the fact that, prison was difficult and I didn't enjoy that, but what upset me more was the fact that I got branded a common criminal. And the Japanese unfairly portrayed me as this very evil man. I certainly contest that. I don't think I'm an evil person. I might have done some things down there to try and disrupt Japanese whaling, but I believed I was on the right side. And international law subsequently has said that their whaling was illegal, but I did find it frustrating to be on the wrong side of the law. And these days I do try and make our operation. Sometimes we do push the boundaries a little bit. We're dealing with organised crime, transnational crime, and sometimes we need to push the boundaries a little bit to go being effective, but I'm conscious of also needing to work within the legal frameworks of the countries that we're operating in. So.
And you talk about legal frameworks. Whaling's illegal now in the region you guys were patrolling, but you've also talked about a lot of countries not obeying the law. So what does that actually mean for whaling?
I think in terms of whaling, Japan lost their case last year in the International Court of Justice, and for the Christmas just gone, for the first time in the last 30 years, there was no whaling in Antarctica. Japan has said they're implementing a new whaling strategy that will meet the their requirements of it being a legitimate scientific program. It remains to be seen whether that happens. Antarctica is really tricky because there's this thing called interplay where it may be legal or illegal depending on whose law you consider it under. So if you take the whaling in the Ross Sea, under New Zealand law, that's New Zealand territory. So they could be prosecuted in New Zealand if we were to ever get them back to New Zealand. Under Japanese law, they think they've issued a legitimate permit for the whaling. So under Japanese law, it's quite legal. Most countries don't recognise New Zealand's claim to the Ross Sea, so then it gets covered by international law, in which case the IWC is the right sort of authority to go covering that. The IWC has said it's a whaling sanctuary, so you'd think, well, that would make it illegal, but the IWC regulations that were formed in the 40s, they say, well, you can do legitimate scientific research. So at the end of all that, it is bloody complicated, and it depends on whose country you are considering it in. And we come across this in my work now, where we're targeting illegal fishing. If you board a given vessel, in some ways you come under the law where that vessel is flagged. So if it's Panamanian or Liberian or Chinese, it comes under those laws. But if it's in the economic zone of a given country, it can also fall under their laws as well. So it does get very complicated and murky, and especially with a lot of these vessels where they'll have multiple flags. They'll have a flag that says they're allowed to fish in Mozambique waters, and they've probably got a Chinese flag floating around somewhere, and they might have another flag of convenience as well. They're very good. These illegal fishing operations really good at document fraud, and they use that to their advantage. And they're transnational criminals that avoid tax and they avoid paying quota fees. And typically they will catch their fish for about 30 to 40% less than what a law-abiding fishing operator will make, and that's how they make their money.
And is there any way to pressurise them from inside China, Korea, to actually make it not cool to be doing this kind of thing?
I think Korea is subject to a little bit of pressure on this. Like, Korea is a big trading nation now, but they are not massive. China, they don't give a shit. They just don't give a shit, mate. Like, I've seen it too many times now, and China wields such a big stick around the globe. All your major trading partners are running scared of China. We saw it, we just did a campaign in the South China Sea, and there's a reef there called Mischief Reef, and the Chinese, it's within the Filipino territory. It's only about 100 miles offshore from the Philippines. It's 800 nautical miles from China, and yet China just waltzed down in there. They brought in 70 boats, big commercial vessels, and they are building a military base. And they had probably 8 or 9 barges sucking up sand off the seabed, like completely destroying a pristine atoll, sucking up the sand and coral, grinding it up, and pumping all of this on this beach to create an airstrip, and then there's this military base which is now half built there. China doesn't give a toss about anyone else. China does what it wants to do, and so their fleet is the hardest to rein in. And what happens is you go catching one of these vessels in a given country, and next thing China's putting political influence to have them let go. And you see this especially in Africa. Chinese fingers are all through Africa now, and not in a positive way. Like, sure, they've come in and built some cheap roads and put in some stadiums. Well, that's to get the timber out. It's to get the fisheries out. You look at all of the rhino that's being plundered. That's all going to China.
Yeah.
Elephant tusk is going to China. The pangolin is going to China. There's so much endangered wildlife being harvested out of Africa and taken back to China. The same thing's happening all through Asia. We just spent 3 months in the Philippines. We busted a couple of smuggling rings there that were taking, amongst other things, turtles and pangolin back to China. Now, the pangolin has become the most illegally trafficked mammal in the world in the space of a few years. And there's some bogus claim that you eat the scales or ground up scales of these pangolin, and it helps lactating women who are having breastfeeding problems.
Where do they come up with it?
Oh, where do they come up with this nonsense? Like, it's completely bogus. There's no scientific merit to that claim whatsoever. And yet the pangolin have become critically endangered. All 7 species are now listed on Appendix 1 of CITES. Another example, this is even more crazy. So there's this thing called porcupine, little prickly animals. They have a thing inside their stomach, or some of them do, called a bezoar stone. And it's basically grass and other things that is like sort of almost calcified and becomes a solid ball, and it gradually grows. The Chinese have started using these in their traditional medicines. Now, we did some work in a place called Lhasa, which is the biggest jungle in Indonesia. It's up in Aceh province in Sumatra. And we started coming across these little snares. And I remember sort of asking one of the rangers, why are they setting such small seeds? And he said, they're trying to catch porcupine. I was sort of like, what's in a porcupine? He explained, there's these bezoar stones that are used now for traditional medicines, and it supposedly it cures cancer, amongst other things. And so now, porcupine, trust me, you go back there in 10 years, and porcupine will be on the critically endangered list for these stupid bezoar stones. And there's no scientific merit to that whatsoever. And you look in Africa now, the Chinese are all through here, and there's a lot of good Chinese people, but as a conservationist, man, there is a lot of bad Chinese who are toxic on the planet and toxic on endangered species. But they don't give a toss about you or I or smaller countries. They do their own thing, and at the moment it involves endangered wildlife and illegal fishing increasingly going back to China.
So there's zero sustainability built into their plan?
No sustainability whatsoever.
Did you see where's the light going to come at the end of that tunnel?
I hope long term that China will become a decent global citizen, because at the moment they're not. Their behaviour globally is a disgrace. What's happening at the moment with their state-sponsored fisheries. There was an area in that South China Sea where they sent their Coast Guard down there to protect their fishing fleet while they fish illegally in Filipino waters. China's introduced this thing called the 9-dash line, where they are claiming roughly 90% of the South China Sea. And they're claiming it from Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, claiming most of that area. And a lot of that, the South China Sea, is amazing. There are parts of the Coral Triangle there, one of the most unbelievable ecosystems on Earth. But if you head north and you go into Chinese waters, they are dead. They are all gone. And so China has this massive fleet, and state-sponsored, they're sending this fleet around the globe and saying, go out there, and there's their own fishery and stuff, go out and harvest everyone else's. And the 9-dash line is part of that. They are trying to secure much of the South China Sea illegally and dishonestly for themselves, and they want fishing rights, and they want oil and gas rights, and they want seabed mining rights, is why they're doing it. They couldn't give a toss about what that ecosystem is and the value it has.
And if you compare superpowers, I mean, how would American environmental policy differ to the Chinese? Because most superpowers are always up to shit.
Yeah, look, superpowers traditionally have been very naughty around the globe, but at least America has a decent environmental policies. I'm not saying they're perfect, but they are a lot better than China. You don't see American boats pillaging around the globe, and you don't see, American.
Maybe they're battleships.
Yeah, maybe, maybe.
And rhino is a big talking point in Africa. I mean, obviously there's a massive demand coming from China. It must be a few inside jobs.
See, that's the rhino is a really tricky one to try and solve. If a poacher's going to get between 10 and 20 grand for a rhino, that's years of pay for a normal job in many parts of Africa. So it is such big money. When there's that much money on offer, locals will always do it. Like, you'll never see, when we did the work in Asia, you'd never see the Chinese guys poaching in the jungle. It was always locals. And Chinese are the middlemen who then facilitate that trade. And they're the ones paying the locals the $500 for the porcupine bezoar stone, or buying the pangolin, or buying the sea turtle, or the forest turtle, or in Africa, the rhino or the elephant tusk. It's these Chinese middlemen who facilitate this trade. But it's really hard to stop impoverished people from earning what is a huge amount of money. And so while that demand remains in China, and while there's the supply chain that allows that trade to happen, you will continue to see rhino getting poached. There's areas in Africa where they are sorting it out. Botswana stands out as a place that does give you hope. They've invested a lot of money in their patrols. They've got a couple of Black Hawk helicopters, and they take their poaching really seriously. And they've been unafraid to invest large sums of money, and they've had considerable help in that industry. But the rhino population, they're pretty sparse, and they're spread out through much of the southern part of Africa, and to patrol all that, it's really difficult. You continue to see rhino getting poached.
Absolutely, and you had a few choice words to say about Paul Watson. What's the difference between the way you run your organisation compared to what you witnessed in that organisation?
Oh, look, I don't want to trash Watson or Sea Shepherd. I do have my disagreements with them, and I think they could have treated me a lot better, and they could treat the volunteers who allow them to operate a lot better. But I'd like to think that my team now, we operate within the law, and we operate with a degree of integrity. And there's plenty of conservation work out for Sea Shepherd and Earthrace and many other organisations. We've all got a role to play in this, and in some ways you're seeing at the moment there is this proliferation of NGOs working on conservation, and that's a good thing. The different approaches have different ways of solving problems, and Pete Bethune's way is not always the best, and there may be other ways that problems get solved as well. And I sort of concentrate on. I'm very conscious of long game. There's a lot of problems around the globe that I might look at, and you need to play a long game on them. Like I want to work on something that's going to make a difference in the long term. It's all very well having a short-term gain or getting something in the media, but at the end of it, you want to affect change in the long term, and that's quite hard to do at times.
And has the notoriety you got from being on the telly helped you on your day-to-day running?
Where it helps me, so I've got a show now called The Operatives, which is in the States and a few other countries, and that certainly helps open doors. I would say my time in Sea Shepherd, it's probably a negative now, like the fact that I ended up in Japan and I got 5 convictions, of which one of them was assault, and that was fabricated. The other 4 charges, no problem. I did disrupt their business. I did have a knife in my possession. I did destroy some of their property. That was my job. But I ended up with an assault charge, which I felt was pretty unfair. It was a pure fabrication. But that doesn't help me these days. The fact that I've got this record when I'm trying to work with law enforcement agencies, and they look up Pete Bethune and here's this, these 5 convictions he got. But thankfully there's a lot of countries look at the work we have done in the last 4 years, and they see, Pete Bethune, he's done some good stuff. He's got a good team with him. He's got some highly skilled guys. I've got a Navy SEAL. I've got a couple of Marine Recon guys. I've got a French SAS guy on the team. I've got a really good set of skill sets within my team, and a lot of these countries, they say, let's give these guys a chance, and we tune up, and hopefully we're professional and impart some knowledge and catch some bad guys along the way.
With whaling becoming illegal, is there any way to rescind those crimes, those on your record?
No, there's no way to get rid of those convictions. But it was 5 years ago now, and There'll be a lot of water under the bridge in those 5 years.
Absolutely. And speaking of biodiesel under the bridge, that's another big passion of yours. How can we get more of that into the main? And who's blocking that from really taking off?
Yeah, biodiesel and renewable fuels in general, it has been a tough gig there. You know, I gave up probably 5 years of my life to promote biodiesel fuel, and then when I started to see it coming through, suddenly everyone went off and started using palm oil for it. And you know, a lot of that palm oil was grown in Malaysia and Indonesia, where they're busy cutting down rainforests to go doing it. And biodiesel remains a very small, you know, I think the biggest consumer of palm oil by a long way is cosmetics. You know, all your liquid soaps and everything, but you try and stop people using liquid soaps. So biofuels it's not the panacea for transport fuels. And human psychology, we want to think there's this miracle cure that will just come in and cure cancer and cure energy and cure everything else, and it doesn't exist. That the future renewable fuels and biofuels have got a role to play, but they will be part of the mix. They're not going to suddenly come in and replace all of the oil and gas we consume at the moment. But there's other things like, you know, conserving things and having public transport and having smaller cars that are fuel efficient and, you know, not consuming all these liquid soaps. You know, I think the future, mankind is going to have to look very closely at where we consume energy and how much we consume. And I think today we live in the golden era for transport. Huge amount of our energy consumption today is for us to get from A to B. And I don't think any future generation will have the same ability to travel so cheaply and so easily. There was a saying I had when I was on the boat: what will people 10,000 years from now think of us? And you look at how much of the world's resource we have consumed in the space of a couple of generations. So much of it. And I think future generations will look back pretty harshly on us. Same in terms of endangered species going extinct. People in the future, they're going to think, what the fuck were they thinking? What were they thinking, you know? And that's where, you know, you're starting to see an awakening now. You're starting to see governments standing up a little bit more. And I've seen it here today in this conference on fish crime. There's government officials from all over Africa and all over the world. They're starting to realise that, you know, hey, our fisheries are in serious decline and we need to start addressing it. And I think you'll start to see that all across the board in terms of energy, in terms of species, in terms of land use, water consumption. These things are all issues that the world is going to have to grapple with. And, you know, I am optimistic about the future. I see so many battles to be had, but the good thing is there's a lot of people starting to care about these things. And I'd like to think that, you know, with my show and other things, that I can play a very small role in contributing to that awareness.
And if you had to get your crystal ball out, what might the vessel of the future look like if you had your way?
I'm going to build a vessel of the future. I hope to start construction in about a year. Vessels will always be really varied depending on their role, but at the moment I'm really focused on fisheries. If you look at fishery solutions around the world, you've got what the US does, where they build 110 to 150 foot, like for example the island cutter class, 110 foot vessels weighing a couple of hundred tons. They burn a lot of fuel, like between 10 to 30 litres an hour depending per nautical mile, depending on the speed. And what's happening is they're decommissioning these and sending them to Africa and Asia and that for their fisheries, but they're totally unsuited, and for two reasons. One is they burn a huge amount of fuel. Like if you want to go out and do a patrol, you go out and burn 20,000 litres of fuel to do a patrol. Now if you're coastal Africa, you haven't got 20 grand to go spending on a little patrol. The second thing is they're steel, and steel boats, they rust. They require a huge amount of maintenance. So if I was to say fisheries vessels of the future, they're going to be composites, and they're going to be long, skinny vessels that are super fuel efficient. That boat Earthrace that I was on, we took that boat over halfway around the world on one tank of fuel.
How big's the tank?
The tank 13,000 litres, so we averaged 1 litre per nautical mile. You compare that with those Coast Guard cutters, which aren't a lot bigger, they're burning at a minimum 10 litres, so they're burning 10 times as much fuel. And you could say, you know, like if you're a conservation organisation, you can't justify that sort of fuel. So I think fisheries enforcement, you will see you need to keep in mind these are not battleships. Like there is the occasional gunfight that happens, but normally that's to a smaller vessel. You don't need to have a warship. You need to have a tactical vessel that is reasonably fast. It needs to be able to do 25, 30 knots maximum. You certainly don't need anything more than that. They need to be efficient, and they need to be able to handle rough seas. And I reckon I can come up with a pretty cool boat to do that.
Well, South Africa wasted their money on those big corvettes. I mean, they really needed those fast attack vessels.
Yeah, look, the vessels like the corvettes have a role to play, but I believe for fisheries, they need to rethink it, and they need to have. You don't need to have a huge crew. A crew of 10 to 12 is plenty. And you'll start to see on fisheries, you'll start to see much better surveillance. You know, satellite imagery has come down enormously in price now. There's a lot of satellites up there that governments can tap into. Once you do deploy those boats, they start clocking up miles, and you know that's part of it. But I think there will be a much greater focus in the future on using satellite imagery and drones and effective use of airborne assets to get surveillance and say, right, here's where these boats are now, let's go and pay them a visit.
And your job's obviously not cheap. Who really supports you on this mission?
At the moment, my work is largely hand to mouth. I've got some donors in the States who contribute to my work, and then my television show helps to pay things. But it seems it's never enough. Like, you know, it doesn't. Whenever a dollar comes in, it gets spent. You think you wish you had another one of those. But I don't know, conservation's, you know, you certainly don't do it for the money.
And how you received in New Zealand?
Received reasonably well in New Zealand. I think I probably get the best reception in the States. Like you know, that's where my network Pivot, who fund the largest part of my show, is based, and are very supportive of the show. I get reasonable support most places, really. You know, once you say, look, I'm here, I'm paying my own way, and I'm here to help you guys on your fisheries, or in some cases we do anti-poaching and stuff like that. There's a lot of respect that goes with that. I don't charge anyone for my work. Yeah.
And you've dealt with you've crewed with a lot of South Africans over the years. Your impressions of the work ethic?
Yeah, I've had various South Africans on my vessels, and also on my film crew. Actually, like South Africa has a lot of very good cameramen. They tend to be a little bit more resilient than a lot of other people that we might have. You know, and the work ethic here generally is really good. You get yourself a cameraman or a bosun on your boat or whatever. They do have a good work ethic. A certain hardness about South Africans. You know, I think Africa in general can be a difficult place, and South Africans, there's a sort of mental toughness about them that I find quite useful at times. You know, South Africa, you can tell them what to do, and they won't bitch and moan. They'll head away and do it. Yeah, I like having South Africans on the boats.
And any exciting projects we should be looking out for you guys?
We will be in Africa next year, and we certainly got a real focus on helping out on the fisheries here. But I think there will be some issues on land that I think could benefit from having a show on them. You know, the big ones you've got is the rhino and also the elephant poaching. So we'll probably go touching on those with an episode or two. But man, Africa has so many problems in terms of its conservation. I think it'd be nice for us to go and cover a couple of issues that aren't so much in the public domain.
Are there some animals that don't get enough press? As elephants get a lot of press, but there's probably
I would say one would be the pangolin. You know, the pangolin is being harvested in huge amounts here, and all sent to China. Most South Africans have probably barely heard of a pangolin in their life, I would think.
So is this political agreement between South Africa and the BRICS, is that for China's benefit almost?
Yeah, I don't know. China, they play a long game, and they are very conscious of securing the world's resource. You know, there's a deal just signed, I'm trying to think who it was with, might have been Mozambique, and part of the deal was 5,000 Chinese got Mozambican citizenship. I could be wrong on the country, I'm not 100%, but you know, China's got 1.5 billion people, and they are very
colonialised.
Well, it's almost like they don't need to take over the world militarily because they're doing it economically.
Exactly.
And I don't mind if Chinese come in and they start to own a bit of land or that sort of stuff. I don't have a problem with that. I'm a conservationist, and what happens when you have all those people come in? Now there's the supply chain that gets set up to go bringing in, let's say, building equipment and personnel and things to go building stadiums or building roads. So there's the supply chain from China to here. The reverse, I'm convinced, is part of their supply chain to take out endangered species and wildlife and resource. And I despise that. It's funny. Like I've never considered myself racist. But as a conservationist, I increasingly have problems with China. We spent about 5 months in Asia working on endangered species and illegal fishing, and all of the time, the end product was going to China. It wasn't going to America. Wasn't going to South Africa or New Zealand, Australia. Every time, it was going to China. And after a while, it's almost like the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Everyone involved in conservation around the world knows that China is the biggest player in terms of the destruction of wildlife and the endangering of species. No one's prepared to say it's a Chinese problem.
And the water as well, damming up all their rivers and all that.
Well, their environmental standards are not that high.
And speaking of standards, how much is South Africa going to beat New Zealand by in the final of the World Cup?
I have a feeling that South Africa, I think you will make it through the quarters. I think you will just topple Wales, but I think the ABs will probably be too good for you in the semis. I'm not saying it for sure, but just in reading and seeing what I've seen thus far, the ABs, they're a good team at the moment. I think the African team, it's a bit older than the All Blacks. A lot of those forwards I look at and think, man, they've been around a few years, and South Africa's journey has been tough. They've had some very difficult games to get through this, and of course losing to Japan at the start put them behind the 8 ball. To their credit, they've bounced back and they've played pretty well since then. But I do think the ABs are probably a next level at the moment.
What's life going to be like after Dan Carter?
Oh, we got plenty of talent in first fives. Dan Carter, it's interesting. He has been there on some key games, but he's been injured quite a few times. We won the World Cup last time without him, but he has been a rock star for New Zealand. We'll lose McCaw as well. I think both McCaw and Carter will retire after the World Cup. Hopefully they retire on a high. I see we play France in Millennium Stadium. In fact, I had my boat Earthrace was in Cardiff in the 2007 World Cup when the All Blacks played France there, and we all went up and went along to the game. And there was a French destroyer docked behind us on the dock, and so we were winding them up before the game, and they were winding us up, and they were "Vive la France!" And then so we went to the game, and of course the ABs lost in what was a pretty humiliating game for the All Blacks.
Dominici was running around you guys.
Yeah, he carved us up, mate. And the French on their day, the French can beat just about anyone. It's interesting if you look at the home unions, Scotland and Ireland have never beaten us. Never beaten. I think Wales. Not sure whether they've beaten us at all. I think Wales might have beaten us once or twice. Yeah, but outside of that, we always beat them. And when you see France play them, it's pretty even between them. And yet France has managed to topple us on numerous occasions. And the French on their day, they can be unstoppable. And they're a little bit like a bogey team for the All Blacks. It's a couple of World Cups now they've tipped us out. Admittedly, we've beaten them in 2 finals as well. But
we've got the Germans in 2 world wars as well. Well, thanks for your time, sir.
Pleasure, mate. All good.